Welcome to the recorded version of Managing the Stress of a Family Caregiver, part of the Family Caregiver Support webinar series brought to you by the American Society on Aging and a generous sponsorship from Home Instead Senior Care.
Our presenter today is going to be Dr. Amy Dupree. Dr. Dupree is a gerontological social worker and an internationally renowned expert on lifestyle issues relating to caregiving, retirement, aging, and family dynamics. Dr. Amy is president of Essential Conversations, Inc. and Dr. Amy, Inc., a company dedicated to family caregiver wellness. Dr. Dupree holds a PhD and master's in social work, specializing in gerontology, and she earned her CSA, a designation for which she also trains others as part of their accreditation. Dr. Dupree is a much sought-after speaker at corporate and professional events on the topics of caregiving, aging, and retirement, and she's a frequent guest on radio and television. And with that, I would like to turn the floor over to our presenter, Dr. Amy Dupree. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here. And welcome to all of you. Today we're going to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure near and dear to many of your hearts, which is how do we really help family members with the stress they experience while caregiving. And I myself spent a decade caring for my parents, and I know many of you who are listening are not just professionals in the field, but you've also been a caregiver, and I think we recognize not just what an important role this is, but how difficult it can be. And you may be familiar with what former First Lady Rosalind Carter said when she talked about caregiving. And she said there are only four kinds of people in the world: those who've been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need caregivers. And I think that's a great way to sum up the extent of the volume of caregiving and the importance of it. So when we talk about in the United States alone, 1/4 of adults are presently caring for an aging parent, relative, or spouse. 1/4. And just think about in your own circle of people that you know, how many people are engaged right now in caring for somebody. Now, in most cases, the caregiver is either the spouse or the oldest daughter or a grown child who lives the closest to the person who needs care. And obviously, caregiving can be a really rewarding and bonding experience. And we also know it can be really stressful and cause lots of tension within the family and stress for the person going through it. There was a recent study conducted by Home Instead Senior Care that found that 31% of family caregivers said they'd really like more help, and 25% said they actually resent other family members who don't help out more. And that's a problem because obviously people aren't getting the help they need, and they're having family issues from caregiving that really we could deal with. Now, the stress gets worse if the caregiver has other really important roles in their life, which many do, things like a job or a child to care for or, another busy aspect of their lives or some distance that they have to travel to care for their aging relative. In fact, we know that caregiving can be particularly hard if someone's caring for a spouse, especially if that person who they're caring for needs around-the-clock assistance. And actually, it can even become dangerous if the spousal caregiver has his or her own health issues to deal with, because the problems can be made worse by the stress of caregiving and the lack of attention that people who are caregiving often pay to their own needs. Now, obviously, family caregivers can't ignore the needs of the person they're caring for, but there really are a number of ways that we can help them reduce the stress and remain healthy during the caregiving process. So let's take a look at the objectives for today. And when you see this list, what we're going to talk about today is about the extent of caregiver stress, some of the things we're already moved into. We'll give a little bit more information on that. We're going to identify the signs of caregiver stress and depression, and then we're going to talk about ways that we as professionals can help families handle these challenges of caring for someone, especially with dementia. And then we're also going to talk about tips and strategies to share with caregivers to just lessen stress, burnout, and depression in general. So let's take a look now at the extent of caregiver stress and talk about really what kind of an issue that is in people's lives. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, more than 50 million people provide care for either a chronically ill, disabled, or older family member or friend during any given year. 50 million. Now, 30% of those people who are caregiving are themselves over 65. So just think about that situation for a minute. 30% of those caregivers are over 65. Another 15% are between the ages of 45 and 54, ages that are often filled with other family obligations. There's no real reliable estimate of the number of family caregivers, but at least 7 million Americans are caring for a parent at any given time. And that number continues to go up. If you're a woman and you're listening to this, it probably will come no surprise to you that the typical family caregiver, as we define it, and this is the National Alliance for Caregiving that really has found this through their research, that the typical family caregiver is a 46-year-old woman caring for her widowed mother who does not live with her. She's married, she's employed, and balancing a lot of roles. Now, in fact, about 60% of caregivers are women, and I always like to say that means about 40% are men, because a lot of times we don't give that enough credit in this. As the American boomer population ages, we know that the need for caregivers will increase significantly in the years ahead. People over the age of 65 are expected to increase at a 2.3% rate, but the number of family members available to care for them will only increase by less than 1%. So I think you can see what's happening. And so as the pool of family caregivers shrinks, what we know is it's expected to result in added stress on caregivers who simply might not have others to help them with the caregiving duties. Already, we have millions of working adults who are juggling the competing demands of caring for a chronically ill or disabled parent, raising a family, and managing a career. Working caregivers sacrifice things like leisure time, and they often suffer stress-related illnesses. Negative effects on working caregivers includes things like they lose time from work, their productivity is lower, they're apt to quit a job to give care, and they give up opportunities that they may have been interested in career-wise, and they lower their future earnings. This is another part of a study done by Home Instead Senior Care. Caregivers comprise about 13% of the workforce. This is a huge issue in the workforce. And nearly 20% of family caregivers are providing 40 hours of care a week or more. So as a result of that, what was found was that about 10% of caregivers have to go from full-time to part-time jobs simply because of their caregiving responsibilities. They just can't juggle it all. Now, all that's having a negative effect on people's wages, as you might guess. The American Council of Life Insurers found that during the year 2000, a typical working family caregiver lost $109 per day in wages and health benefits. And I just want to repeat that because it's so significant. $109 per day lost in wages and health benefits due to the need to provide full-time care. And what we know is that eventually about 12% of caregivers quit their jobs to provide around-the-clock care. So this is pretty important stuff, and we as professionals need to talk about how do we help these family caregivers who are also working. So let's, as a starting point, talk about some common employee support programs that you might want to recommend to the families you're dealing with. The MetLife Mature Market Institute found that American businesses can lose as much as $34 billion each year due to employees' needs to care for an aging relative. And both male and female children of older parents make changes at work in order to accommodate caregiving responsibilities. And again, that includes things like modifying their schedule, coming in late, leaving early, altering work-related travel. There's also a term that we talk about, which is presenteeism, the idea that you're there, but you're not really there because you may be answering the phone all the time and trying to deal with perhaps a parent who has dementia, who's calling constantly. Although hard research doesn't exist to prove this, researchers in the field think that only 2% of employed family caregivers actually take advantage of the benefits their company offers. So that's why it's important for us as professionals to really encourage them to do this. So some of the ones you could potentially recommend to your caregiving clients, a lot of employers offer some cafeteria-style employee benefits, which allows the employee to select supplemental dependent care coverage to reimburse costs for in-home care or adult daycare. And again, many people don't even know that exists. The other thing that the cafeteria-style benefits might also cover is counseling for the employee to help them cope with the stresses of caregiving, which is key. And human resource or employee assistance program staff can provide information on helpful internet sites, local information and referral services or resource centers. And there are, in larger businesses, often there is in-house caregiver support groups, or they coordinate with local community groups or hospitals so that employees can attend an outside support group. One of the most critical benefits that we know employees often need when they're caregiving is time. And flexible work hours, family illness days, leave time are really necessary. So you want to encourage the caregivers you're working with to ask if they can modify their work schedule to accommodate their caregiving needs. You know, oftentimes we know that employees don't tell their employer that they're caregiving. And really often they then miss out on support and benefits. And so finding ways to accommodate the employer's need to get the job done and their need to honor their caregiving responsibilities is key. And I know many times caregivers are afraid that if they talk about this, it may jeopardize their job. But in actuality, it may help because they'll then have some support or at least some awareness from the people they're working with of what they're going through. Now, if their company has 50 or more employees, then it has to comply with the Family and Medical Leave Act, which allows for up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave to care for a seriously ill parent, spouse, or child while protecting job security. And many smaller firms actually use those FMLA guidelines to provide support for individual employees. It's really important that people step back and take the time to learn what's offered by their employer. Doing so can really help alleviate their stress. Speaking of stress, what we're now going to do is talk about some of the physical and emotional signs of stress. I always kind of chuckle when I do this because I often will say to people, my guess is I probably don't need to tell you about the signs of stress because you probably either are or have experienced every one of these. But let me go over these, and we can talk about, again, from the standpoint of professionals working with caregivers, it's important that we both recognize these and teach them to recognize them. Because once they recognize the signs, then, of course, the next step is to find ways to both manage those, enlist support, and hopefully reduce these signs of stress. So you see a list there of physical symptoms on your screen. I want to add a few to that. So we have, after weight gain and loss, some others where it says and more. Well, some of the and more include things like loss of hair. When people are very stressed, they often lose hair. Fatigue. High blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and palpitations can be an issue, and I'm sure you can see the seriousness in that. Chest pain is often a problem for people. Perspiration may become a problem. Skin disorders such as hives, eczema, psoriasis, developing some sort of a tic where, you know, their eye is twitching or something like that, or constant itching somewhere. All of those things can be signs of stress. Periodontal disease and jaw pain can be signs of stress, and I'm sure you can see where many people end up clenching their jaw at night or grinding their teeth. There can be reproductive problems or infertility, and oftentimes it just impacts people's immune system, so it suppresses their immune system in a way that results in more colds or flu or infection. And then sexual dysfunction or just a lack of libido is often an issue when people are really stressed. Now, that's on the physical side. Let's talk about the emotional side for a moment. On the emotional side there, you see a number of things listed. I want to highlight there, we're going to talk about depression in more detail in a few minutes, but I want to highlight the substance abuse issue because that often increases for people when they are caregiving and they are feeling stressed, and I think it's key that we recognize that. People often will just say they have butterflies in their stomach, or they find themselves more irritable or getting more easily frustrated or having road rage. That'll happen. Just feeling out of control, that their life is out of control, or developing phobias for things can happen. Also, many times people just become more argumentative. Again, this is that irritability, argumentative thing. Feeling isolated, dissatisfied with a job. So as professionals, again, I think it's our job to help our clients recognize these, notice the way that stress affects them physically, because sometimes people have an easier time seeing it physically than emotionally. And one of the recommendations that's often made, and I like this recommendation, is that if somebody doesn't think it's impacting them emotionally, they might want to talk to their spouse or their kids or their close friends and notice how they're reacting to them. And then also maybe just ask those people, have you noticed any changes? You know, a lot of times family members accommodate this increased grumpiness, but if asked about it, they will say, yeah, I have noticed things have changed. And a lot of times, just by getting that feedback, it may help your client be able to put their finger on the symptoms that they're experiencing and start getting help. Now, if a client's experiencing any of these symptoms, again, the goal is to get some help, and especially if they're experiencing more than 2 or 3. Most of us who are living very busy lives will find that we get into stressful times at various times and we'll experience some of these. But if they're ongoing and there's more than a few, it really is something that people need to talk with a healthcare professional about to help them evaluate the situation. Getting support really can help reduce the stress, and it will also help reduce the symptoms that you see. If you think about these, they're really just symptoms of what's going on in people's bodies and in their minds. And so we need to recognize the symptoms, address those, but even more importantly, address the root cause of them. And I think another thing as professionals we need to do is to remind caregivers it is absolutely not selfish to focus on their own needs and desires when they're a caregiver. In fact, it's vital that they take initiative to take care of their own physical and emotional care. We know that caregivers who do neglect themselves become less useful as a caregiver over time, and it can also negatively impact their health for the years to come. I often will say to people now, because they get this quickly, you know, you would never expect your cell phone to run endlessly without recharging it. You would never expect your car to run without putting gas in it. So why would you expect that you're different than that? You need to recharge your battery. You need to make sure that you give yourself the fuel that you need. And oftentimes that's the wake-up call for people if they can go to a very tangible place around this. There was a study that was done that really highlights this by Elisa Epple from the University of California. And Elisa found that family caregivers experiencing extreme stress actually age prematurely. This level of stress can take as much as 10 years off their life. Isn't that amazing? 10 years off a caregiver's life. And according to an article that was in the Journal of the American Medical Association, older spousal caregivers, so the elderly themselves, who have a history of chronic illness, who are experiencing caregiving-related stress, have a 63% higher mortality rate than their non-caregiving peers. 63% higher mortality rate. So again, both from the protection of their health, and then if they die, they're certainly not there to be able to care for the family member. So there's both the protection of their health and then the practical issue of saying to them, you know, you're needed. You need to take good care of yourself. And a lot of times I found caregivers will do this if they think that their loved one may suffer if they're not there. So obviously stress causes many physical changes in our bodies. It can also trigger depression. So let's hone in on this next section and talk about caregiver depression and some ways we can help our clients cope. Many of us are quite familiar with the symptoms of depression, but I think let's back up for a minute and talk about how pervasive this is for family caregivers. Again, this was a study from the American Journal of Public Health, who says that family caregivers who provide care 36 or more hours a week are more likely than non-caregivers to experience symptoms of depression or anxiety. So with a lot of people providing that much care, that's a big issue. And if we talk about spouses, the rate is 6 times higher. And for those caring for a parent, the rate of depression is twice as high. So we see really increased depression rates among caregivers. Interestingly, when you look at men versus women caregivers experience depression at a higher rate than men do in general. So caregiving doesn't cause depression, nor will everyone who provides care experience the negative feelings that go along with depression. But in an effort to provide the best possible care for a family member or for a friend, what we know is caregivers often sacrifice their own physical and emotional needs, and then the result of that is often negative experiences, both emotionally and physically. So what that means is they may have feelings of anger and anxiety and sadness, isolation, exhaustion, and then they have guilt for having those feelings, which, again, exacts another heavy toll. So I think we have to really support caregivers in understanding that those feelings of depression that they're experiencing are not a sign of weakness. Rather, they're a sign that something's out of balance, because a lot of people, again, add to the feelings of depression and anxiety guilt or the feeling that somehow they're not good enough. So this idea of feeling not good enough, feeling guilty for having these feelings, then just exacerbates the depression and the anxiety. We also know that oftentimes other people will say to them, just snap out of it, or it's all in your head. And we know those things aren't helpful. But it does reflect kind of a societal belief that mental health concerns are not really all that real. And I think we have to help our clients understand that ignoring or denying these feelings does not make them go away. And often, if they don't deal with them, it gets worse. So we know people experience depression in different ways, and the type and degree of symptoms vary by individual and obviously can change over time. You see a list of symptoms here, and what we often say is if people experience these for more than 2 consecutive weeks, then it may indicate depression. So obviously the change in eating habits and sleep patterns, feeling tired all the time, loss of interest in things that typically they've had interest in, easily agitated or angered, feeling nothing that someone does is good enough, I can't do anything well enough, and obviously more seriously, thoughts of death or suicide or attempting suicide. Ongoing physical symptoms that do not respond to treatment, such as headaches, digestive disorders, and chronic pain, can also be a sign of depression. And it's, again, helpful for us to review these so that we can help our clients be aware of these symptoms and encourage them to seek help if necessary. Okay, what I want to chat with you about now are ways to prevent serious depression. So when we talk about serious depression, obviously this is things much worse than just, having an occasional depressed mood. We know that early attention to symptoms of depression may really help to prevent the development of more serious depression over time. The guidelines I'm going to share with you and the recommendations are from the National Institute of Mental Health. And I would encourage you to think about, do you have people, clients that you know who would benefit from these recommendations that would help them really be more aware that their depression is perhaps getting out of control and that they can do things, take steps to make it better. So the first thing you see there is set realistic goals. And that means in light of the depression. So understanding that you may not be able to do everything all at once, but you have to set goals and you have to assume a reasonable amount of responsibility. That's what we're talking about. And what this is a goal to help people to get back in control of their life. The second thing is they can break large tasks into small ones, set some priorities, and do what they can. So again, you can hear there's an element of taking control on this. Third thing they can do is to try to be with other people and to confide in someone. It's usually better than being alone and secretive. The whole issue around social support is so key now. We know that people who have good social support are much less apt to experience things like depression and anxiety. The fourth thing is to participate in activities that help them feel better. Mild exercise, and by the way, the latest research really shows that exercise can have a significant impact on depression. Some of the studies are showing that regular exercise can have as much of an impact on depression as the drugs, especially the class SSRI drugs. So it can be very, very effective, and effective also when used with other things such as drugs and therapy. But thinking about what people can do that they enjoy, and again, if you have a client who's depressed, they may need you to help them sit and think about what is it I used to enjoy doing, whether it's going to a movie or a ball game, going to a religious service, a social event, something in the community, whatever it is, getting them to think about that. And then I think what we can say to people, expect your mood to improve gradually, not immediately. Feeling better really does take time. And then 6, it's really advisable for them to postpone important decisions until the depression has lifted. So before deciding to make a significant transition, like changing jobs or getting married or divorced or moving, it's better to step back and to discuss it with others who know them well and who have a more objective view of their situation. It's often recommended, when people have lost someone they love dearly, that they wait a year before making a decision. And really, there's no magic number in a year, but it is that idea of stepping back, giving a little time, so that decisions aren't made from the basis of the depression or the grief. We know that people rarely snap out of a depression, but they can feel a little bit better day by day. It's a little like crawling out of a hole rather than snapping out of it. The most frequent treatment for depressive symptoms that have progressed beyond the mild stage is antidepressant medication in conjunction with ongoing talk therapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy. And obviously, we want to refer them to a mental health professional to assess their condition and arrive at the right treatment protocol for them. Now, before we get into ways that you can help your caregiving clients cope with the stress of caregiving, we're going to talk about one of the more difficult situations, and that's the challenge of dealing with persons with dementia or Alzheimer's. Many family caregivers are presently caring for a parent or a spouse who's suffering from some form of dementia. Now, as probably all of us know, the frequency of dementia increases with rising age. So if we look at 65 to 69-year-olds, it's less than 2%. If you go to 75 to 79-year-olds, it's 5%. And if you go to 85 to 89-year-olds, it's more than 20% of persons who have dementia. And caring for someone with dementia, as we know, requires a lot of time and a lot of patience, and it can cause great stress to the caregiver, particularly as people's memory loss progresses. According to Drs. Janice Tycolt-Glaser and Ronald Glaser, the stress of family caregiving for persons with dementia has been shown to impact a person's immune system for up to 3 years after their caregiving ends. For 3 years after they've stopped being a caregiver. And obviously that puts them at greater risk of developing a chronic illness themselves. Okay, now just as a little step back here, let's review for a minute what dementia is. And again, this may be very familiar to you, but it's a way you can talk to your caregiving clients about this too. What I always say to people is, it's true we all have memory lapses as we age, and that's not really what we're talking about, because the term dementia describes a group of symptoms that are caused by changes in brain function. So these changes obviously have serious consequences, not just on memory, but on personality and behavior. So we know that people with dementia tend to repeat questions, become disoriented in familiar places. They often neglect their personal hygiene or nutrition, or get confused about people or time. Obviously, the causes of dementia are many. Some of them are reversible, or at least they can be stopped. They don't necessarily increase. Things that are impactable, such as vitamin deficiencies and poor nutrition, reactions to medications, or problems with thyroid are examples of that. However, some forms of dementia, as we know, are irreversible, such as those caused by mini strokes or Alzheimer's. And we know that 60 to 70% of people who suffer from dementia, the cause is Alzheimer's. So when we talk about Alzheimer's disease occurs when the nerve cells deteriorate in the brain due to a buildup of what we call plaques and tangles. And those plaques and tangles we can see in the brains upon autopsy of a person who has Alzheimer's disease. And what they do is the plaques and tangles result in the death of a large number of brain cells. We don't know why it happens. Doctors are obviously doing a lot of research to determine both causes and cure, but according to the Alzheimer's Association, right now, 4.5 million Americans are presently living with Alzheimer's disease. As we all know, it's progressive, and so it often ends up with the afflicted needing total care 24 hours a day. And this is obviously very physically demanding for the caregiver as well as emotionally demanding. One of the hard parts is that this person, this loving relative that someone has, may eventually start behaving like a total stranger, despite all the time, love, and care that the caregiver has devoted to their well-being. And as we know, oftentimes people with this disease can become abusive, both verbally and physically, which further compounds the incredible stress for the caregiver. Richard Schultz, who is it's Dr. Schultz out of the University of Pittsburgh, who does a lot of work on caregiver stress. He says, we really have to be aware and warn that caregivers of an older relative or spouse with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia are at a great risk of suffering from depression, anxiety, frustration, stress, and anger. So again, as professionals, we need to help families understand that when we're dealing with this all the time, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that family members may not know these things. Research shows that caregivers of a family member with dementia face particularly stressful demands because of the length of time they have to care. As we know, this disease can go on 20 years in some form. They also can have a lot of stress from the behavioral and cognitive problems associated with dementia and the extreme impairment of people who are with end-stage dementia. Therefore, what Dr. Schultz advises is that caregivers really learn about the challenges they face and then seek assistance early on in their caregiving role. As professionals, one of the things we can really say is not to wait until it gets overwhelming. The time to really get the help and to get the input is early on in the caregiving role, because at that point, before it's overwhelming, people have the capacity to learn what's coming, to get plans in place so that they don't have to get to that place of experiencing great depression and anxiety. Okay, let's talk about some specific things that we as professionals really can suggest for people caring for someone with dementia. So here are some guidelines that you can share with your clients who are caregivers. The first thing you can suggest them is to understand the disease. This means read about it, what the impacts are, so that they're prepared as it progresses. What we know is family members who have this level of understanding, who understand what's coming, usually have more patience because they no longer think that the person's doing this on purpose or they're trying to get them, if you will. They understand this is simply the disease that is causing the behavior. So really, this is a key thing for them to have this information because they're less apt to get angry. They're less apt to see it as a personal issue. They recognize it's a medical condition. The second thing that we recommend is to enter their world. And what that means is, we know you can't shake somebody out of dementia. You can't say the right thing that's going to have them understand what's going on. So instead of trying to correct a person with Alzheimer's disease, helping family members understand that asking simple questions about some statement they made, even if it seems strange, or it's about a person who's no longer living, will be a better way to go. This makes both the person with dementia and the person caring for them less frustrated. So again, entering their world means just accepting what is and not trying to correct them or to help them see that they're wrong about something. So the third thing there says strike a balance. Really what this is about independence and really encouraging as much independence with the person who has the dementia as much as possible. So that means helping the person with dementia by prompting or cueing them to do things for themselves when possible, and then realizing that they'll probably need to step back if their relative's safety or well-being will be compromised in any way. This is always a balance between safety and independence. The problem is when someone has dementia, obviously they're not able to determine their safety, so it's important to make sure they're very safe, and at the same time, they still need independence. The fourth thing there says get support. So this means really encouraging the caregiver to enlist the help of family and friends to spend some time with this person with dementia to give the caregiver a respite. And we're going to talk more about respite, but it's key. They can also join a local support group for people who are caring for someone with dementia or Alzheimer's disease. but getting practical and emotional support is key, as is tapping into resources. So family caregivers often find that they're spending quantity time versus quality time. So what that means is they're running around doing the shopping, taking the relative appointments, cleaning, versus really just spending time with their relative. And this is a key difference. I've often heard family caregivers, when they have enlisted some help, whether it's home care or gotten their loved one into an adult day program so that the time they do spend together has more quality, that they say, I feel like I've gotten to be the daughter or the son or the husband or the wife again. So they move out of feeling like they're just running around being the caregiver back to being the family member. So we can really encourage families to investigate enlisting the help of a professional caregiver for the everyday tasks so that the person can spend more time with their loved one and really be able to appreciate that time together. And I think this is so key. And again, people often feel guilty about this, and I will say the goal is not that you provide all the care, but that you make sure this person you love gets the best care possible. And that doesn't mean you have to do all of it. It's a partnership between the family and professionals, between the family caregiver and the other family members, and getting them to step out of feeling they have to do everything is key. The seventh thing is to create a positive and a comfortable environment. This means really reducing overstimulation, distractions. So even things like street noise or a loud television or radio can be really difficult for the person and can increase their agitation or anxiety. Family members also can learn to use more effective communication when speaking to their family member with dementia or Alzheimer's disease, being aware of the rate of their speech, their pitch, their tone, trying to modify it, trying to reduce the complexity of their speech. And then right along with that is using positive body language. So we know greeting the person in a way where you come towards them, not come from behind, which often creates a startle effect, having a facial expression that's relaxed and open. We know that people with dementia pick up on tension and stress very quickly. So if the caregiver is tense, the person with dementia will often respond to that. And I think we all can agree it's incredibly challenging to do this, and we need to help people through resources. So a couple of resources, and we'll talk about these again. The Alzheimer's Association, which is alz.org, is a great resource. And Lisa's Place, which is LEEZAS, place.org, are places that we can send our caregiving clients to get more information, to get guidance, to get support. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is talk about ways to de-stress for the caregiver and help them take better care of themselves. So those were great tips for how to provide better care for someone with dementia. This is more generic now for the caregiver. What can they do? And we know that caregivers, most of them, struggle to balance caregiving for an aging parent or relative with other major responsibilities, the job, the family, the rest of their life. So it means that the last thing that they often do is care for themselves. And we know that often results in poor health, higher levels of stress, and a diminished ability to care for the person they love. So I think, again, reminding people about their cell phone batteries. They wouldn't think they could run their cell phone forever without plugging it in and recharging it. They've got to do it for themselves. And exercise is one great way to do that. We know it makes a big difference. So is eating right, getting enough rest, and keeping up with their own medical appointments. So when we're talking about exercise, it's really getting people to find something they like to do. This does not have to be arduous. So it could be walking, dancing, biking, running, swimming, whatever, for a minimum of 20 minutes at least 3 times a week. If we could get people started with that and then get them to increase, they'll see the benefits. We can suggest that they learn a stress management exercise such as yoga or Tai Chi, which also teaches balance and relaxation and inner balance, not just balance with the body. Meditation. We know that when people can quiet their minds and sit quietly when things are going too quickly and they feel overwhelmed, that it often creates an immediate relaxation response. A lot of times caregivers will say, I don't have a minute to do this. And what I say to them is, you have to take at least a minute to do this. They don't have to sit for an hour and meditate. They can do a minute or 2 minutes several times a day, and their stress level will go down. Another thing they can do is ask for help. Now, again, according to a national survey that Home Instead Senior Care conducted, 72% of adults who are currently providing care for an older adult do it without any outside assistance, 72%. So we have to help them see that that doesn't have to happen that way. So to avoid burnout and stress, they really need to enlist the help of other family members, of friends, of professionals. They might hire a non-medical caregiver for assistance. And we need to help them do this without having feelings that they're not good enough or they're guilty. Now, one of the things that we know is a lot of people don't know how to ask for help. So there are 4 really surefire ways that we can suggest that they can enlist support. The first one is make sure everybody in the family has a responsibility. Even if it's small, it helps spread out the task. So a lot of times people will say, well, my sibling lives 1,000 miles away. There's nothing they can do. Actually, there is. They can be responsible to call the aging parent once a week to check in or visit for a week each year. So it allows the other caregivers to get away on a vacation. They can also make phone calls from the distance of things that need to be done. The second thing is really to divide up the task. And what we mean here is having a specific family member who handles, for example, the medical aspects of your relative's care, such as talking with the doctors and medication information, and another relative might be responsible for groceries and meals, and another paying the bills. So by doing this, each person becomes more involved with the details of the task they're doing, and they can keep each other abreast of changes and issues. And Mary Alexander, who's going to join us in a few minutes for the question and answers, did this really well with her family when they were caring for her mom. The third thing is to make sure to talk with other family members about what's going on. So if the caregiver doesn't express their concerns about the debilitating health or about the amount of time they're spending caring for someone, they can't expect their family member to know what they're thinking and feeling. And something that I've observed in doing this work for so many years now is that family members don't share that information, and then they get angry that their other relatives don't know that. The fourth part of this is really helping. We got to help people not be control freaks. If they want to control every aspect of the care, then they shouldn't be surprised when other family members are less apt to step in. They'll think that the person has it all under control. They'll also be less able to understand the stress level the person has if they believe that it's being created because they're being a control freak. Okay, so that's the ask for help part. Let's go back now to the list where it says take a break. This means make arrangements for any necessary fill-in help that includes family, friends, volunteers, or professional caregivers. Really, it's about taking a day or even a week's vacation, but people have to line up care so they can be confident their loved one is both safe and happy, and then they need to go do things they wouldn't typically do. So whether it's reading the book they haven't read or doing something. But again, we can really help them practically understand this is important and figure out how to get the care they need so they can take a break, hopefully a week, but even a day at a time. Respite care, which is short-term, temporary care, is something that people can use to do this, and this will help caregivers get a break. Now, respite services may involve overnight care for an extended period of time or just a few hours per day. Respite is often called the gift of time, which is truly what caregivers need. Well, respite care does sometimes require financial outlay, but it has to be weighed as an option when you think about supporting the mental stability and the physical health of the caregiver. So, again, we can encourage our caregiving clients by saying, I know there's some money involved, but if you get sick, there's going to be money involved in a different way. So helping them understand that is key. Even using just a couple of the services, such as errands and shopping, can really help lessen the burden of caregiving considerably. So agencies that provide information and respite services are agencies like hospice care, home health agencies, non-medical senior care agencies, social services, private nursing companies, senior centers, churches, or the National Family Caregivers Association. Continuing down the list, making sure that people eat well helps reduce stress. This includes plenty of fruits, vegetables, low-fat proteins, including nuts and beans, and whole grains. Getting people to stop using caffeine and fast food and sugar as quick pick-me-ups, because we know that also means a quick letdown. And then taking care of themselves, and this really means about getting to their own doctor's appointments, their own annual checkup. Being a caregiver provides a lot of excuses for people for skipping their necessary checkups, but we really have to encourage them not to do it. And then if they can indulge occasionally, whether it's a foot massage, a manicure, a nice dinner out, or a concert or something that takes them away from the situation and rewards them for the wonderful care they're providing. And again, they shouldn't feel guilty about wanting to feel good. They have a right to feel good while they're caregiving. Finally on this list is finding support. Local caregiver support groups may be a way to go, a friend, whatever it is. The nice thing about local caregiver support groups is they may get very practical advice from people who are also in a similar situation, and they'll have people that can bounce off those feelings of stress because everybody is probably experiencing some of that. In the end, I really think we can encourage caregivers to maintain their sense of humor and to know that it's okay to say no to another responsibility and that they should not feel guilty about taking time for themselves. So again, a lot of times people won't do it for themselves, but they'll do it for their loved one. And so we can remind them if they don't take care of themselves, they may not be there to take care of the person that they love. Okay, so let's now look at some resources. We gave you 3 here, and I also want to add to that because I mentioned it, but we didn't put it up, about Lisa's website. So we'll give you that URL again. It's slipped my mind. It's Lisa something, but Mary will give it to us when she gets on. And these websites are very, very helpful. Caregiverstress.com has fabulous resources for caregivers. The next one's the Alzheimer's Association. You can click on your local area by going to the map. And caregiver.org is the Family Caregiver Alliance. They have wonderful, wonderful information on there. And then let's click now and just talk about some next steps from here before we open up the phone lines. So some things you can ask yourself. What can you do to help your clients lessen their stress or depression related to caregiving? What resources do you need to share with your clients to help them learn more about Alzheimer's disease or other dementia? And what can you do to encourage your caregiving clients to take better care of themselves? I think those questions are really key. They're not just throwaway questions. And I hope you'll think about the clients you have now and which one could benefit from these. Because, I know a lot of times in the busyness of our jobs, we often don't step back and think of these things specifically. And this is a great opportunity to do that. I'm now going to pause and turn this back to Steve, and he's going to open up the phone lines for questions. Steve?
Excellent presentation, as always, Dr. Amy. A lot of great
information.
Thank you. And as Amy mentioned, it is time for the Q&A portion of today's webinar, so text us in those questions. At this time, I also want to welcome Mary Alexander from Home Instead Senior Care to the Q&A portion of today's webinar. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you, Steve, and hello, Amy.
Hi, Mary.
Okay, let's get right to it, presenters. The first question, what are your suggestions on reaching some of these caregivers in order to help them? Many of them seem to self-isolate. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this is Mary. I'm going to jump into this one just because we see this so often at Home Instead. Caregivers think that they're the only ones going through it. They also have some guilt, a lot of them, because they feel like they should be able to handle caring for their mom or dad or loved one without feeling that it's a burden or stressful or whatever. And so they do tend to isolate. I think it's pretty easy to know when someone's going through something, especially a caregiving situation. So when you see changes in behavior with someone, simply ask the question, because really caregivers need to talk. Sometimes they just need the invitation to talk. But again, most caregivers, especially when caring for mom and dad, are not just going to offer up I'm so stressed out, I'm caring for my mom and it's not going well, or I'm not doing it well, or I'm struggling, because to some people it seems as though it's a bit of failure. Amy?
Oh, I totally agree with that, and I think I don't really have anything to add to that. I think that's a great answer, Mary.
Okay, next question. Can you say anything about the link between caregiver perceived burden and resentment and the abuse of elders and adults with disabilities?
That's a good question. Well, I'll jump into that, Mary, if you want. We do know that, when people, if we look at what leads to caregiver abuse, abusing older adults, we know that the issue of stress and frustration are huge contributors. And what's different from, if you think about spousal abuse in younger years, that's about power over somebody. This is really about feeling a lack of power and out of control. And I think when we look at all the reasons that we really need to support family caregivers, the list is endless. This is another one of the reasons that we know we could impact the amount of abuse that older adults are experiencing if we did a better job making sure that their families had the resources that they needed. It wouldn't necessarily end the problem, but it would have a huge impact. So I think as we look both as professionals and as a society, when you hear some of those figures that we went over early in the presentation, there's a real need to support family caregivers, especially as the aging population grows and the caregiver population, family caregiver population shrinks.
You know what, I agree with that. I also think that there's a huge piece of family dynamics that play into this. If you didn't have a great family dynamic growing up, you're not going to have a great family dynamic when your parents are aging. And so you really need to look at the picture as a whole to really understand what's happening. When I was going through caring for my mom during her terminal illness, I would have cut off my right arm to do whatever she needed. But you know what? I had a friend who did not have a good childhood, did not have parents like I did, and couldn't understand how I completely changed my life to help my mother. And so I think, again, there's so much background that goes into what happens in a situation like this. There's a lot of resentment in some cases.
Okay. Part of what we like to do as part of these webinars is share some of the resources that our attendees provide to us, and this is one of those. One of our attendees wrote in, I co-lead the Powerful Tools for Caregivers classes 3 to 4 times a year. These should be mentioned as an excellent resource for family caregivers. You can look online for classes nearby. And again, that's the Powerful Tools for Caregivers classes. Check that out online. Back to the questions. The next question is, do you have any suggestions for how to get a male child more involved in the care of the parent? How can I encourage this as a social worker?
I'm going to jump in right here. I have a brother who really struggled with helping care for my mom. And what we realized is very early on that all of my siblings were trying to be the person in charge. And we were all trying to decide and be completely in sync with what was going on. But it was kind of a nightmare. And we realized my brother, although he wanted to say in what was happening, he really struggled to help with any hands-on care, even to the point of just coming to the house to do normal things, because there was this huge fear factor that he had, although we didn't know it was a fear factor. And so as we sat and talked about it one night, and it's why Home Instead created the resource 50-50. It's how siblings share the care. We realized that it didn't have to be equal. We realized that my brother had a different role he could play, and he assisted us with running the family business so that my sisters and I could totally focus on my mom, her care, her treatment, and all the other issues that we were dealing with, while my brother had such a key role that allowed him to still be a part of what we needed, but took off the care. The reality is some people are just not born to be caregivers, and they, out of fear or whatever else, just don't do a good job. And I think we have to recognize that, because if you put someone in a position that they simply can't do or scared to do, or it's just not their forte, everybody loses in that situation. And I think that families, especially siblings, have to be mindful of that.
Okay. Next question, is the social worker or a case manager the best person to advise a caregiver on getting help?
The question is a social worker, is it either or I'm not sure I understand the question.
I believe the question is the social worker or the case manager the best individual to advise a caregiver on getting help if they need it? would that be the best resource to approach the caregiver for suggesting help?
I think they're an excellent resource to do that, and I think whatever role actually a professional is in, they can do this. So I think one of the key things is to have awareness of what some of the issues are, and then the awareness of the resources, and share those. So those people who are on the line right now who maybe aren't in those roles but are interacting with family can also play a role in this.
Okay, next question. Are there different issues for caregivers who are also raising grandchildren?
Interesting. We're seeing more and more of that today for a number of reasons. And I'm in that role, actually. So I would tell you yes. I don't know that there are more stresses. I think they're different stresses. It's very much like being in the sandwich generation. Instead of this being my grandchild, and it's almost like being my child. So I think I'm more tired because I'm a grandparent, helping take care of my dad and helping raise a grandchild. But I don't necessarily think it's all that different. It's just I just didn't think I would be in this situation in my life. So I would say different, maybe more stressful. No, I think it's equally as stressful.
Okay.
And I would agree. I think it's, for some people it's that. For other people, it's really the balancing of multiple roles is what we're talking about. That's the key. And I think the multiple role in that case happens to be, raising grandchildren and doing this. But some people are in multiple roles of caring for several different people in different generations. And I think that's the real issue, is the balancing of multiple roles. And how do you do that?
Okay. Can you comment on this scenario? What if the person being cared for will not allow any other family members help? They depend on one person, especially a wife or older daughter, because they are the most reliable. Can you comment on that?
This is, to me, and Mary, I'm sure, is going to have something good to say here as well. I think often this is where a professional can really come in and sit down and talk to the person and say, this isn't reasonable, and you're burning out your family member, and they need help. And again, a lot of times people will do things for someone else they wouldn't, even if they don't want the other person in, if they think it's harming the person they love, that they'll be more open to it. Not always, but sometimes that is the case. And I think that when I work with caregivers on this issue, I really do talk to them about, you have a right to set boundaries on this. Not every older adult is reasonable. And my guess is that unreasonableness has probably been going on a long time. And so, we're not talking about in the case of dementia now. We're just talking about people who've been difficult. And because someone says, I won't let anybody else, doesn't mean that has to be allowed to go on. So I think, again, saying I can't do this and sticking the boundaries around this when there's other options available is key. Mary, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, Amy, you were right on when you said balance. I know that my mother preferred us doing different roles, but the reality was that, I had a sister that wasn't flexible in her job. She had to work. She didn't have the flex time that I had, although my sister did task better in some respects. And so really we just sat down with my mom and really explained, these are all the things that we felt needed to be done, and these are all the things that we wanted to get done and that we had to share it. And although my mom wasn't necessarily still totally in sync with it, eventually she gave in. But you know what? The reality is you have to have open communication, because you cannot overstress one person in the family. It's simply not fair. And then no one really wins in that situation, not the senior and certainly not the caregiver.
And Mary, I just want to add one thing to that, because it reminds me of something that I will often say to families. We live in the context of family. We're not individuals, and we want to provide wonderful care to our aging family members, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the family gets sacrificed for that. And oftentimes that's really having to take a more united front and saying, we have to look at choices that are good for everybody, not one person at the expense of everybody.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time for today's web seminar, but I want to thank our presenters, Dr. Amy Dupree and Mary Alexander, for another great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.